Okay, so today we're diving into neurodiversity.
Feels good.
Yeah, we've got like a really interesting mix of sources here.
Uh-huh.
We've got a big, broad overview from Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Then we've got Psychology Today, kind of looking at some of like the benefits of different thinking styles, particularly in the context of autism.
Right.
A clinical perspective on autism spectrum disorder from Up to Date, and then some thoughts on terminology and identity from the Daisy Chain Project.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about this selection of sources is we can go from the really big picture,
Yeah.
like what is a definition, and then we can look at some really specific examples, and then kind of the clinical and
Well,
personal.
like, what does it actually mean for people going through this?
Exactly.
Yeah, so for you listening at home, the mission of this deep dive is to really understand what is neurodiversity, where did this idea come from, and some of the really important conversations that are happening around it, especially when it comes to autism. You want to understand the different viewpoints. You want to understand what the practical implications of this paradigm might be.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. What exactly is neurodiversity?
Well, in essence, the neurodiversity paradigm suggests that the differences we observe in how people experience the world, their sensory processing, their motor skills, their social styles, how they think, what they focus on,
Right.
all of these things are natural variations in brain wiring within the human population.
Okay.
So it's a spectrum.
Right. So it's not that we're all wired the same and there's some people who are wired differently, but it's more like
So
there's,
all sorts of different wiring.
it's like biodiversity, like it's natural for humans to have this variation.
Okay.
And in fact, it might be really important for us as a species to have these different ways of processing information and being in the world.
So a core idea here is that this variety in how our brains work is normal. And it's actually a good thing, a positive aspect of humanity.
Absolutely. It's not something to be feared or eradicated. Okay, so then we hear this term neurotypical all the time.
Right.
What does that actually mean within this paradigm?
Neurotypical basically refers to individuals whose brain functioning and thinking styles fall within what we kind of think of as the average or
Right.
the typical range within society.
Okay.
So it's sort of like the dominant neurological pattern.
Okay, so just kind of like the majority
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
in terms of how their brains function.
Yeah.
And then when someone's brain functions in a way that differs from that in some significant way, then we would use the term neurodivergent.
Exactly. And neurodivergent and neurodivergence describe individuals whose neurocognitive functioning diverges from those dominant societal norms
Right.
in multiple ways. And it's really important to recognize that this term is meant to be inclusive.
Yeah.
And so it's not just neurodevelopmental differences like autism, ADHD, and dyslexia,
Uh-huh.
but it's also things like variations in mood, personality, eating patterns. Really any trait where you see a significant deviation from that neurological mainstream.
So it's a really broad and intentionally inclusive term.
Yeah, it's trying to encompass this whole range of human experience.
And the Wikipedia entry mentions this idea of moving away from the pathology paradigm. Can you explain what that means and why that's significant?
Yeah, so the pathology paradigm is essentially the medical model of disability,
Okay.
where you see differences as illnesses or disorders
Okay.
that need to be treated or cured.
Right.
And the neurodiversity framework really tries to move away from that
Okay.
by saying these variations aren't necessarily problems to be fixed.
Right.
They're just part of human diversity.
Right.
And this has a really huge impact on how we approach support, research, and inclusion in society.
Right. Like, are we trying to fix people or are we trying to help
Okay,
them
copy.
live better lives within the context of who they are?
It's about supporting people to be their best selves,
Yeah.
not trying to make them fit into a narrow definition of normal.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I notice some people prefer to use terms like neuroconforming instead of neurotypical and allistic to mean not autistic.
Yeah.
What's the reason for using those specific terms?
I think those terms are really trying to highlight certain aspects that neurotypical might overlook.
Okay.
So neuroconforming really emphasizes that there are often societal pressures
Right.
to think and behave in certain ways,
Uh-huh.
and that individuals labeled neurotypical often conform to those expectations,
Oh, right.
sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously.
Okay.
So it really highlights that there's a norm,
Yeah.
and then you're conforming to it.
Right.
And then allylistic is a more specific term, meaning not autistic.
Okay.
And it's particularly useful in discussions that are focused on autism within the broader context of neurodiversity,
Okay.
because it avoids this implication that everyone who's not neurodivergent
Right.
is somehow part of this single undifferentiated group.
Hmm.
Like there's this huge variety.
Yeah, it's not like there's just like the normal group and then everyone else.
Exactly.
There's all sorts of variations within that.
Yeah.
That really clarifies the nuances in terminology. Now let's look at where this movement actually came from. Like, where did this neurodiversity movement originate?
So the neurodiversity movement really gained momentum in the late 1980s and early 1990s,
Okay.
and largely thanks to the formation of Autism Network International.
Okay.
And this group facilitated a lot of early communication and community building through autism conferences.
Mm-hmm.
Most notably Autreat, which was organized and run by autistic people themselves.
Oh, interesting. So this is not something that like came out of academia or the medical field.
No, it was very much a grassroots.
It was a grass
Grassroots.
movement
Yep.
by people who were autistic.
Yeah. And pen pal lists and early online platforms like Usenet were also really crucial for connecting people.
Okay, so that was like the very early days of the internet where people were actually like using it for real connection.
For community building.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it's really vital to understand that this movement emerged from the broader disability rights movement. It was really building on the social model of disability.
Uh-huh. And what does that mean, the social model of disability?
Yeah, so the social model makes a critical distinction.
Okay.
That disability isn't solely the result of an individual's inherent limitations or differences,
Okay.
but it arises partly from societal barriers
Mm-hmm. Okay.
and a mismatch between the individual's needs
Okay.
and the environment around them.
So it's not just that you have a different way of processing information or a different way of being, but it's that the world around you is
Isn't set up
not supporting you.
to accommodate that way of being.
Yeah.
So, for example, someone with sensory sensitivities might find a brightly lit, noisy office environment
Right.
completely overwhelming to the point where it's disabling.
Right.
But in a calmer, more sensory-friendly environment,
Right.
those same sensitivities might not be much of a barrier at all.
Okay, so the context
The context really matters.
really matters. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
Okay. The neurodiversity movement also brings in this idea of biodiversity, right?
absolutely.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so biodiversity is this idea that diversity in all its forms,
Okay.
including neurological diversity, is a natural and valuable part of any ecosystem,
Right.
including the human one.
And this is something that comes up a lot in conversations about like the environment and keeping ecosystems healthy.
Yeah.
So it's applying that same idea to
The human.
human brains.
Yeah, and it also aligns with the political movements of other minority groups,
Okay.
really advocating for the rights and acceptance of individuals with neurological differences.
Okay, so it's framing it as a civil rights issue in a way.
Yeah, you could say that.
That's interesting. And Wikipedia mentioned that some people see this as a kind of middle ground between the strong medical and social models of disability.
Yeah.
So how does that balance work?
So some proponents would argue that neurodiversity offers a way to acknowledge both the lived experiences and the very real challenges that neurodivergent individuals can face,
Right.
something that a purely social model might sometimes be seen as downplaying,
Okay.
while at the same time rejecting a purely medicalized view
Right.
that focuses solely on deficits
Mm-hmm.
and the need for cures or normalization.
Right. So you're trying to hold both of those things at the same time.
Yeah, it's like a both-and approach.
Yeah, that seems like a really important perspective because you don't want to minimize the challenges
Exactly.
that people actually face. But at the same time, you're not saying, okay, we need to fix you. You're broken.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
Yeah. So how has this idea of neurodiversity impacted different areas of life? Like, where are we seeing this conversation happening?
I mean, we're seeing it everywhere now.
Yeah.
So in education and the workplace, there's a growing awareness of the specific challenges neurodivergent individuals might encounter.
Right.
And there's a real push for more inclusive and effective support programs. But, as the Wikipedia article points out, the effectiveness of these programs can vary significantly.
Right.
And really highlights a need for more research and more individualized approaches.
Right. Because again, neurodiversity is so broad.
Yeah. It's not one size fits all.
You can't just have like one support program that works for everybody.
You have to really understand individual needs.
And social media is a huge force these days in so many social movements.
Absolutely.
So what role has social media played in the neurodiversity movement?
Social media has been incredibly powerful for neurodiversity awareness and support.
Okay.
I mean, it gives neurodivergent individuals platforms
Yeah.
to connect with each other, share their personal experiences, build communities, and advocate for their rights and perspectives.
Uh-huh. So it's really raising awareness
Yeah.
among people who might not otherwise know much about neurodiversity.
Yeah, it's really raising awareness, but it's also
Yeah.
providing these vital connections and support networks within the community.
Right. It's a way for people to find each other and connect and support each other.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
that can be so crucial for people who might feel isolated or misunderstood.
Yeah. So what about in more formal settings like medicine and healthcare?
Yeah.
How is this paradigm influencing those fields?
Well, we're definitely seeing a move towards more neurodiversity affirming practices
Okay.
in medicine, healthcare, and therapy.
Okay.
And these are practices that really recognize and respect
Yeah.
neurodivergent ways of being.
Okay.
And this includes things like adapting communication styles, therapy techniques, even the physical environment of clinics
Right.
to be more accommodating.
That sounds like a really positive development.
It is.
But Wikipedia also mentions some scientific debates and research findings that are relevant here.
Right.
So what are some of the key points that are emerging?
Well, one significant point is a growing recognition that past autism research may have inadvertently overemphasized deficits
Okay.
by primarily focusing on areas where autistic individuals differed from neurotypical norms. And this might have caused us to overlook
Yeah.
their unique strengths and perspectives.
Right.
And I think this really ties into what Psychology Today was saying about the benefits of different thinking styles.
Right.
That we should be looking at the whole picture,
Right.
not just the deficits.
Absolutely.
And there are also increasing ethical concerns surrounding attempts to suppress certain autistic traits,
Okay.
such as stimming
Yeah.
or intense focused interests.
Right. Especially if these behaviors are not harmful
Exactly.
to themselves or other people.
Especially if they're not harmful.
Yeah.
Because research is increasingly suggesting that these behaviors can actually serve important functions,
Okay.
like self-regulation of sensory input
Right.
or emotional states.
So it's like from our neurotypical perspective, we might see something and think, oh, that's
Right.
a problem behavior.
Real behavior.
And not realize that for that person, it's actually
It's actually really important.
an important coping mechanism or a source of
Yeah, it's a way of being in the world that helps them.
Yeah, that's a really key insight.
And furthermore, there's a growing body of research indicating that masking or camouflaging autistic traits,
Mm.
which is consciously or unconsciously trying to appear neurotypical,
Okay.
is often associated with negative mental health outcomes.
Okay. Like what kind of outcomes?
Things like increased rates of anxiety, depression,
Yeah.
even thoughts of self-harm.
So that's a really huge,
Just a huge burden.
yeah, huge burden to carry.
Yeah, to constantly be trying to fit in
Yeah.
when it doesn't feel natural.
And some research even suggests that traditional behavioral interventions
Right.
might inadvertently encourage or reinforce masking.
Yeah, because they're often designed
Right.
to make people appear more neurotypical.
Yeah.
And this really raises concerns about the long-term mental health effects.
Right. So we need to be really careful
Yeah, we need to be very mindful
about the interventions that we're using.
and prioritize well-being and self-acceptance over just trying to normalize people.
Absolutely. Now, Wikipedia also mentions this controversy surrounding neurodiversity,
Yes.
particularly this concern that it might downplay the challenges faced by autistic people
Right.
who have higher support needs.
Right.
And I think this is a really important point to bring up.
It's a really important point, and it's a major concern
Yeah.
for some families and advocates for those who require substantial support
Right.
in their daily lives.
Because they might worry that this focus on neurodiversity and acceptance might minimize
Yeah.
the very real difficulties that people face.
They might worry that it's shifting the focus
Right.
too much to the experiences of autistic individuals who are more independent,
Yeah.
and that it might lead to a reduction in resources and support for those with higher needs.
Yeah. That's a really valid concern.
Yeah, it's something we have to be really sensitive to.
So how do proponents of the neurodiversity paradigm typically respond to that kind of criticism?
Well, generally, proponents argue that the paradigm doesn't deny the existence of disability
Right.
or the need for support,
Okay.
but instead it's trying to reframe how we understand and provide that support.
Okay.
They emphasize that needing significant support doesn't diminish a person's worth
Right.
or their place within this spectrum of neurodiversity.
Yeah.
And they also point out that our current definitions of normal functioning
Right.
and what constitutes a high or low level of need
Yeah.
are often based on neurotypical norms
Okay.
and can be very culturally and economically influenced.
Right.
So they're really advocating for support systems that are person-centered,
Right.
respectful of neurodivergent ways of being,
Yeah.
and focused on quality of life,
Uh-huh.
rather than just achieving these neurotypical defined milestones.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's not about saying, oh, everyone's fine
Right.
and we don't need to support anyone. It's about
It's about
shifting how that support is provided.
it's about recognizing that support looks different for different people,
Yeah.
and it's about meeting people where they're at.
Right. And this leads to the idea of neurodiversity affirming interventions.
Yes.
So what does that actually look like?
Neurodiversity affirming interventions are those that actively incorporate the experiences, strengths, interests, and feedback of neurodivergent individuals themselves.
Okay.
So it's really about collaborating with the people you're trying to
Yeah.
support.
So not just doing something to them,
Exactly.
but doing something with them.
Yeah, it's a partnership,
Yeah.
and they move away from trying to eliminate neurodivergent traits
Oh, okay.
and instead focus on providing support in areas where individuals genuinely need it,
Right.
while also valuing and building upon
Yeah.
their unique ways of being.
Okay. So can you give some specific examples?
Sure, so this might involve things like reforms in how social skills are taught,
Okay.
a more respectful and consent-based approach to applied behavior analysis, or ABA, and occupational therapy that focuses on sensory regulation and environmental accommodations,
Right.
rather than forced compliance.
Yeah. So it's like meeting people where they're at
Exactly.
and working with them to make their lives better
Yeah.
in a way that makes sense for them.
Yeah, and it also connects to this ongoing discussion about depathologization.
Okay. And what is depathologization?
So depathologization is this idea of no longer classifying certain neurodivergences as medical disorders.
Okay.
And as the Wikipedia entry mentioned, autism advocate Nick Walker has proposed a distinction here.
Okay.
He suggests that innate neurodivergences, like autism, might be better understood as fundamental aspects of a person's neurocognitive makeup,
Okay.
while other conditions like epilepsy or traumatic brain injury
Right.
might be viewed differently,
Right.
perhaps as conditions that could be addressed
Right.
without fundamentally altering the individual's core identity and way of experiencing the world.
Yeah. So there's a difference between something that is part of who you are and something that's happened to you.
Right, and it's a complex and evolving area of thought.
Yeah. It's not a simple black and white
No,
issue.
that's very nuanced.
Yeah. That's a really interesting distinction.
Yeah.
Now, psychology today focuses a lot on this idea of the benefits of different thinking styles,
Right.
particularly in the context of autism.
Right.
So what are they talking about there?
So the article really emphasizes that differences in thinking have often been a catalyst
Okay.
for innovation and progress in science, art, and technology.
Yeah.
Like throughout history, when you have individuals
Right.
approaching problems from diverse perspectives,
Uh-huh.
it allows for the identification of novel solutions and insights
Right.
that might be missed by those with more homogeneous cognitive styles.
Right.
So the article suggests that autistic individuals with their often unique ways of perceiving and processing information can bring these really valuable alternative perspectives to the table.
So it's kind of like, we always talk about diversity in the workplace.
Yeah.
And the idea that if you have a more diverse group of people, you're going to get better outcomes.
You're going to get more creative solutions.
And it's applying that same idea to neurodiversity.
Exactly.
That's really cool. And they also mentioned this idea of savant syndrome,
Right.
which, again, important to note,
Very rare.
is a very rare thing.
Yeah, it's not representative of the majority.
But what is it?
So savant syndrome is this phenomenon where individuals
Okay.
exhibit these extraordinary skills in specific areas.
Like what kind of areas?
So things like memory, mathematics, music.
Okay.
And while it's not something that we see in most autistic individuals,
Right.
it does illustrate the remarkable potential that can exist alongside autistic traits.
Right.
And some researchers believe that these exceptional abilities might actually be linked to differences in brain structure and organization.
So their brain is literally wired in a way that allows them
Potential.
to do these amazing things.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And then they also talk about people who are twice exceptional or 2E.
Yes.
What does that term refer to?
So twice exceptional describes individuals who are both intellectually gifted
Oh.
and have a learning or developmental difference,
Okay.
such as autism, ADHD, or dyslexia.
Okay.
And this concept really underscores that neurodivergence and giftedness
Can go together.
can co-occur.
Yeah.
and that individuals can possess both significant strengths
Right.
and significant
It's
challenges.
not just one or the other.
It's not one or the other.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
It's that complexity of individual neurocognitive profiles.
Yeah. It really challenges our idea of like there being a single dimension of ability.
Yeah, we have to think more broadly.
Yeah. And Up to Date provides this much more clinical perspective.
Yeah.
So let's dive into that.
Okay.
What does Up to Date have to say about autism spectrum disorder?
So they describe ASD as a neurodevelopmental condition that affects social interaction, communication, and behavior.
Okay.
And they really emphasize the spectrum nature of ASD, meaning that the presentation of symptoms and the level of impact can vary
Right.
hugely from person to person.
So two people can have autism but have very different experiences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No two autistic people are the same.
And the diagnostic criteria have evolved over time, haven't they?
Yes, they have. So the current framework, based on the DSM-5TR,
Okay.
involves a single diagnosis of ASD,
Okay.
with specifiers to indicate the individual's level of language and intellectual impairment,
Right.
as well as the level of support they require.
Okay.
And previous more specific diagnoses, like Asperger's syndrome, are now encompassed within this broader ASD category.
Okay, so it's all kind of under one umbrella now.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a more inclusive approach.
And when do the signs and symptoms of ASD typically first get recognized?
While the characteristics are present in early development,
Okay.
symptoms are often first recognized by parents or caregivers between the ages of 2 and 3 years,
Okay.
though sometimes they might be noticed earlier or later. And early indicators can include delays in speech and language development,
Okay.
lack of typical social reciprocity,
Right.
and reduced eye contact.
And what about repetitive behaviors like stimming?
Yes, stimming is a very common characteristic.
Okay. And what is stimming for people who might not be familiar?
So stimming refers to repetitive motor movements or vocalizations
Okay.
that can serve various functions like self-soothing, managing sensory input,
Yeah.
or expressing emotions.
Okay, so it can look like a lot of different things.
Yeah, it can range from hand flapping and rocking
Right.
to more subtle behaviors.
Okay.
And in addition to stimming, there's also this strong preference for routine,
Okay.
insistence on sameness, and highly focused or restricted interests.
Right.
These are also core features of ASD.
And a lot of autistic people experience sensory sensitivities, right?
Yeah, that's also very common.
Okay.
And this can involve either heightened or lowered responses to sounds, lights, textures, and other sensory stimuli.
So it's not always that they're like overly sensitive.
Right.
It can be that they're
Sometimes they're undersensitive.
undersensitive. Okay.
Yeah.
So how is ASD actually diagnosed? Like what's the process?
So Up to Date outlines that ASD is diagnosed through a comprehensive evaluation using the DSM-5-TR criteria.
Okay.
And this typically involves a detailed developmental history gathered from parents or caregivers,
Okay.
direct observation of the individual's behavior, and often the use of standardized diagnostic assessment tools.
Okay.
And while primary care physicians can initiate the evaluation and sometimes make a preliminary diagnosis,
Okay.
referral to specialists like developmental behavioral pediatricians, child psychiatrists, or neuropsychologists is often necessary for a more definitive diagnosis and a comprehensive assessment.
Right. So you might start with your regular doctor,
Yeah,
but they might say, okay, we need to send you to someone who specializes in this.
exactly.
And it sounds like the evaluation isn't just about identifying ASD itself.
Right.
It's also about looking for other conditions.
Yeah, so the evaluation includes screening for other conditions that frequently co-occur with ASD.
Like what kinds of conditions?
So things like intellectual disability, language impairments,
Okay.
genetic syndromes, and other medical conditions.
And genetic testing is often recommended as well.
Yes, often including chromosomal microarray analysis and testing for Fragile X syndrome.
Okay.
And it's also really important to consider other conditions
Right.
that might present with similar symptoms.
Okay, so like what would be an example of that?
So something like intellectual disability without ASD,
Okay.
Rett syndrome, or ADHD.
Right. And Up to Date says that a key differentiating factor for ASD is the presence of reduced social reciprocity.
Yes, that's a really important distinction
Okay.
because many conditions can share some overlapping features with autism,
Yeah.
but reduced social reciprocity is often a hallmark of ASD.
So once a diagnosis is made, what happens next?
Well, Up to Date really emphasizes the critical role of early intervention services
Okay.
and ongoing follow-up care.
So early intervention is really key here.
It can make a huge difference.
Okay.
And while there's currently no cure for ASD,
Right.
interventions aim to support development, improve functional skills, and help individuals reach their full potential.
Okay.
And this usually involves a structured, individualized treatment plan
Right.
that addresses the individual's specific needs and strengths.
So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all.
No, it's very tailored to the individual.
Okay.
And importantly, up to date also highlights acceptance, self-advocacy, and family support
Right.
as integral components of a positive outcome.
So it's not just about therapy or medication.
No, it's about the whole environment.
Right.
And the primary care physician plays a vital role in all of this
Okay.
by initiating the evaluation, facilitating referrals to specialists and early intervention programs,
Yeah.
and providing ongoing preventative medical care and support.
So it sounds like a very collaborative approach.
Yeah, it takes a village.
Yeah. Okay. The Daisy Chain Project has some interesting things to say about terminology and identity. Yes.
Within this neurodiversity framework.
Right.
So let's talk about that.
Okay.
What are some of their key points?
They really emphasize that autism is a difference in how individuals process information,
Okay.
experience their sensory environment, and engage in social interactions. And they really advocate for the perspective of difference, not deficit,
Right.
which really aligns with those core principles of neurodiversity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they highlight the wide variability among autistic individuals
Right.
and the importance of recognizing this diversity.
Right.
So no two autistic people are the same.
And they talk about the different terms that people use to identify themselves?
Yes, so they acknowledge that autistic individuals may prefer various terms,
Okay.
such as autistic person on the spectrum or person with autism.
Oh.
And they also point out that the term Asperger syndrome
Right.
is no longer a formal diagnostic category.
Yeah.
So it's really outdated terminology.
And what's their stance on what term people should use? They really emphasize the importance of respecting individual preferences.
Okay.
So the most respectful approach is to always ask an individual
Right.
how they prefer to be identified
Yeah, and honor that.
and honor that choice.
Okay, that's a really good point.
Yeah. And the Daisy Chain Project also has specific preferences for the language used
All right.
when discussing autism and neurodivergence more broadly.
Okay, so what are some of their preferences?
So based on their understanding of community preference,
Okay.
they generally use identity-first language,
Okay.
such as autistic person or neurodivergent person.
Okay.
And they strongly advocate for the use of positive and neutral language
Right.
and discourage terms like symptoms suffer from affected by,
Right.
or these often problematic and unhelpful labels of high functioning and low functioning.
Right.
Instead, they recommend using terms that focus on support needs and simply acknowledging differences.
Okay, so I can give an example of that.
So instead of saying someone is low-functioning autistic, they might say an autistic person with high support needs.
Okay, so it's framing it in a more positive and
Yeah.
respectful way.
It's about recognizing the individual first
Yeah.
and their needs.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So for our listener out there who's been taking all this in, Dan, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive into neurodiversity?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that neurodiversity represents a fundamental shift in how we understand neurological differences.
Yeah.
It's a move away from a perspective of deficit and pathology
Uh-huh.
to one of natural human variation with inherent potential strengths.
Yeah, it's a really different way of thinking.
It is,
Yeah.
and it's fueled this really powerful social movement advocating for acceptance accommodation and a move away from purely deficit-based approaches,
Yeah.
particularly concerning autism.
And it emphasizes understanding and supporting neurodivergent individuals
Yep.
within their own unique frameworks, rather than trying to force them to conform to neurotypical norms.
It's about recognizing